The first thing anyone noticed was the scream of brakes against wet pavement, sharp enough to cut through the midnight rain like a blade. Headlights sliced across the narrow street, catching the small figure of a girl in torn clothes standing in the middle of the road, one hand raised, the other clutching a piece of stale bread to her chest. On the other side of the street, under the glowing gold lights of the most expensive hotel in the city, a black luxury car had come to a violent stop just inches from disaster. Inside sat billionaire Adrian Vale, a man who owned half the skyline and trusted almost no one. He would later say that the moment his eyes met the frightened but determined gaze of that beggar girl, his life had already begun to change, even if he didn't know it yet. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of one small act to change a life, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel before we continue. Stories like this remind us that humanity still lives in unexpected places. Adrian Vale was the kind of man newspapers loved to write about and people loved to judge from a distance. At 42, he had built an empire from almost nothing: real estate, technology, shipping, luxury brands. His name carried the weight of power in every boardroom across the country. Yet behind the polished interviews, custom suits, and magazine covers was a man worn thin by years of betrayal and loss. Success had given him wealth beyond imagination, but it had taken from him almost everything that once made life feel warm. His mother had died when he was 12, a gentle woman who had believed in feeding anyone who came to their door hungry. His father, once a hard-working mechanic, had fallen into debt and despair, leaving Adrian to learn early that the world did not forgive weakness. He had fought his way upward with relentless determination, turning pain into ambition. But somewhere along the climb, the boy who once believed in goodness had been replaced by a man who believed only in evidence, contracts, and control. That night, Adrian had just stepped out of the grand opening gala for one of his newest hotels. The event had been a success on paper. Politicians, celebrities, investors all smiling for cameras, but inside he felt nothing. His assistant had handed him a silver box moments earlier, a luxury dessert sent by an anonymous, well-wisher from inside the event. Adrian barely glanced at it. Gifts came often, so did hidden motives. As his driver pulled the car toward the curb, the little girl appeared out of nowhere, barefoot in the rain, shouting with a desperation that startled even the hardened security team. Her voice was trembling, but her eyes were fierce. She wasn't begging for money. She wasn't asking for food. She was trying to stop him. Security rushed toward her, but Adrian, for reasons he couldn't explain, stepped out of the car himself. She looked no older than 10. Her dark hair was soaked and tangled, her face smudged with dirt, but there was something unmistakably honest in her expression. She pointed toward the silver dessert box, still resting on the leather seat inside the car. Her words came in a breathless rush. She had seen one of the kitchen staff in the hotel's rear alley tampering with the food box before it was sent inside. At first, she thought it was just another meal being packed away. But then she noticed the man looking around nervously before sprinkling something from a tiny vial into the dessert. She had tried to warn the hotel staff, but no one listened to a homeless child. Adrian's jaw tightened. He was a man who lived in a world of schemes and silent enemies. Yet part of him immediately dismissed the girl's story. People lied for attention. They lied for money. Still, there was something about the terror in her face that made him pause. He motioned to his head of security. The dessert was taken immediately for testing. The next 15 minutes felt endless. Rain tapped against the hotel awning as Adrian stood beneath it, watching the little girl shiver in silence. She refused the umbrella offered to her, clutching her stale bread as if it were treasure. When the call finally came from the on-site medical consultant, the world seemed to tilt. The dessert had been poisoned, not enough to kill instantly, but enough to cause a severe allergic reaction and cardiac distress. Particularly dangerous because Adrian had a known nut allergy. The toxin was hidden expertly, almost impossible to detect without close analysis. For the first time in years, Adrian felt genuine fear. He turned to the girl. She looked down, almost as if ashamed to have spoken at all. In that moment, the billionaire who had spent his life believing only in power found himself staring at the one person in the city who had nothing, and who had just saved his life. Her name was Sara. She lived under the old railway bridge with her younger brother, Sammy, who had been sick for weeks. Their parents had died in a factory fire 2 years earlier, leaving the children to survive alone after distant relatives refused to take them in. Sara begged not for herself but for medicine and scraps of food for her brother. Every night she wandered the streets near restaurants and hotels, collecting leftovers before the bins were emptied. Adrian listened in stunned silence. He had walked past people like Sara all his life without truly seeing them. They had been part of the background of the city he owned in pieces, but did not truly know. He told security to bring the children to a safe place. Sara resisted at first, fear written all over her face. The streets had taught her that promises from powerful people often came with hidden costs. But when Adrian personally promised that no harm would come to them, something in his voice made her believe him. That night, for the first time in years, Adrian did not return to his penthouse. Instead, he followed the security team to the railway bridge. What he saw there shattered something inside him. Beneath rusted beams and leaking tarps, children slept on cardboard sheets. An old woman coughed violently in one corner. A boy no older than 7 lay curled up with a fever, his face pale and lips dry. Sammy. Sara rushed to him, kneeling beside her brother with a tenderness so pure it made Adrian's throat tighten. He had seen billion-dollar losses without blinking, yet the sight of this little girl sacrificing everything for her brother moved him in a way nothing else had. Adrian immediately ordered his private doctor to attend to the boy. The diagnosis was severe pneumonia worsened by malnutrition. Without treatment, Sammy might not survive another week. Adrian had him transferred to the best private hospital in the city that very night. News of the attempted poisoning broke by morning. The city exploded with speculation. Who would try to poison Adrian Vale? Business rivals, political enemies, former partners. But Adrian's thoughts kept returning not to the investigation, but to Sara sitting beside her brother's hospital bed, refusing to leave even long enough to eat. He visited the hospital that evening. Sara stood when he entered, uncertain and guarded. He placed a tray of food on the table beside her, fresh bread, warm soup, fruit. She hesitated before taking the first bite, as though expecting it to be taken away. Something broke in Adrian's heart at that moment. He remembered his mother. She used to tell him that the world reveals its truth in how it treats the hungry. The poisoning investigation quickly uncovered a shocking truth. The culprit was not a random enemy, but someone inside Adrian's own company, his trusted chief financial officer, Marcus Hale. Years of hidden fraud and embezzlement were about to be exposed by Adrian's internal audit. Desperate to protect himself, Marcus had planned the attack. The betrayal cut deep. Adrian had trusted Marcus for over a decade. The police arrested him within 48 hours. But the deeper wound remained. Adrian realized that the only honest soul he had encountered in days was a little girl the world had ignored. As Sammy slowly recovered, Adrian found himself visiting the hospital every day. At first, it was out of gratitude, then curiosity, then something deeper. Sara had a way of seeing through people. She asked him once why he always looked sad, even when everyone around him called him successful. No board member had ever asked him that. No friend had ever dared. The question stayed with him. He began to spend time not just with Sara and Sammy, but at the shelter he had arranged for the children under the bridge. He funded beds, meals, medical aid, and schooling. But even as he did, he understood that money alone was not enough. These children did not only need food, they needed to be seen. Weeks passed. Sammy recovered fully. Sara smiled more often now, though the sadness in her eyes never completely disappeared. One afternoon, Adrian visited the old bridge again. It was raining lightly, much like the night they met. Sara stood beside him, looking at the city skyline. She told him she used to imagine one of those shining towers was a castle where good people lived. Adrian looked at the tower bearing his own name. For the first time, it looked less like an achievement and more like a wall between worlds. That night, he made a decision that shocked the business world. He announced the creation of the Elena Foundation, named after his mother, dedicated to housing, healthcare, and education for homeless children and struggling families. Entire apartment blocks owned by his company were converted into low-cost family housing. Unused hotel kitchens began serving hot meals daily. Medical clinics opened in neglected neighborhoods. The media called it a redemption story. But Adrian knew the truth. He was not saving anyone. Sara had saved him, not just from the poisoned dessert, from the poison he had allowed into his own soul, cynicism, isolation, and emotional numbness. Months later, Adrian invited Sara and Sammy to visit his penthouse. They stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Sara's eyes widened at the lights. But what touched Adrian most was not her amazement. It was the way she immediately asked if the children from the shelter could visit too. Even now, even after everything, her first thought was others. Adrian smiled. He had spent decades building wealth. This child with nothing had mastered generosity. Before the story reaches its ending, I want to ask you something from the heart. Please comment below with one word that describes what kindness means to you. Your words may inspire someone who truly needs hope today. Winter came. The city turned cold. One evening, Adrian received a call from the hospital. An elderly woman from the bridge shelter was in critical condition. Without hesitation, he rushed there. To his surprise, Sara was already at the woman's bedside, holding her hand. The woman passed peacefully that night. As they walked out into the snow, Sara quietly told Adrian something he would never forget. She said the greatest gift was not money, but showing up when someone feels alone. Those words struck deeper than any business lesson he had ever learned. Years later, the Elena Foundation became one of the largest charitable networks in the country. Thousands of children were housed. Families were reunited. Lives were rebuilt. Sara and Sammy grew up in safety, education, and love. Adrian legally adopted them after a long and emotional process, giving them not only a home but a family. At Sara's high school graduation, Adrian sat in the front row with tears in his eyes. She was valedictorian. Her speech was not about success. It was about compassion. She spoke about the night one choice changed everything. How people often ignore the smallest voices. How miracles sometimes arrive in torn clothes and bare feet. How saving one life can awaken another. Adrian wept openly. The audience stood in applause. He no longer cared about appearances. He had learned that strength was not found in hiding emotion, but in embracing humanity. Near the end of his life, Adrian often returned to that rainy night in his memory. The scream of brakes. The silver box. The frightened little girl in the street. He knew with absolute certainty that if he had driven away, he might have died physically. But by stopping, he had been reborn emotionally. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your engagement helps keep stories of hope, kindness, and second chances alive for others who may need them most. And so the city that once knew Adrian Vale only as a billionaire came to know him by another name, the man who learned to listen. But those closest to him knew the fuller truth. A little girl who had nothing saw danger where everyone else saw luxury. She risked everything to warn a stranger because kindness was the only wealth she possessed. In saving him, she gave him something far greater than life. She gave him purpose. And in the end, it was never the billionaire who changed the beggar girl's life. It was the beggar girl who changed the billionaire's heart forever.